Hello again. Today's lesson is titled 7.2, the Old Law versus the New Law. So the outline for 7.2 goes as follows. First, we're talking about the Old Law, then the New Law, and then we're finishing up with a brief comparison of the two. Okay, here we go. So the Old Law. Here's a picture of God handing the Old Law to Moses on Mount Sinai. So that leads us to our first section. Okay, so section A, Moses and Mount Sinai. So the Old Law refers to the law of Moses. The law of Moses. So Moses, as you may recall from the book of Exodus, was the person who God chose to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. And after freeing the Israelites out of slavery, Moses led them to Mount Sinai in the desert. And it's there on Mount Sinai that God gave the Old Law to Moses. So one thing worth taking note of here is the fact that God gave the law to Moses after freeing the Israelites from slavery. And so what this shows us is that the old law was meant to help God's people live in freedom. Okay? So if you think about it, if they were slaves in Egypt, okay, and so they needed laws to live by as a free people. Okay, so this will help us understand that when God gives us laws and God gives us moral laws to live by, they're meant to help us live freely. Okay, they're meant to honor our freedom. So by giving the law to Moses, God then established a covenant with his people, the Israelites. So in this covenant, God established a relationship between himself and the Israelites. And the purpose of the covenant was to restore the loving relationship between God and his people that was lost because of original sin. Okay, so the purpose of the covenant was to restore what was lost because of original sin. And so that leads us to the Ten Commandments. So it's during the event on Mount Sinai, God gives Moses the Ten Commandments, okay? And so the Ten Commandments are kind of the summary of the Old Law, okay? The Ten Commandments are the most famous part of the Old Law. However, there were many other laws that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. In fact, by most accounts, according to tradition, God gave 618 laws on Mount Sinai. Okay, so, the Ten Commandments are the most easy to remember. They're the most famous part of it, but they sort of outline the basic requirements of the covenant that God gave his people. All right. And so the Ten Commandments teach the Israelites how to live in a proper relationship with God and with their neighbors. Okay. So we're going to look at the Ten Commandments in more detail later on, but for now, that's good enough. All right. Next, the new law. Fast forward a couple thousand years to Jesus. So here's a picture of Jesus giving the new law. Okay. So Jesus gave the new law in what we call the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 5 through 7. And it's a very famous passage in the Gospel of Matthew because it's here that Jesus really lays out what is required for true Christian discipleship. Okay, so in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus explains what it means to be a Christian. And so there's a direct connection between Jesus giving the Sermon on the Mount, okay, and Moses receiving the new law on Mount Sinai. Okay, in fact, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is sort of the new Moses. Okay, so Moses went up a mountain to get the Ten Commandments. Okay, likewise, Jesus went up a mountain and he gave and delivered the new law in the Sermon on the Mount. Mount is short for mountain. Okay, now, so the new law fulfills the old law. The new law fulfills the old law. What does that mean? Jesus himself said that I came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. And so abolish means to end. So Jesus admits that he is not trying to end the Ten Commandments. He's not trying to end the old laws, but he's trying to fulfill them. He's trying to show how he embodies what the law is all about. Okay, and the law is all about loving God and loving neighbor. Okay, so if we want to truly and best love God and best love our neighbor, we need to follow the example of Jesus. Okay, that's what he means when he's saying that he fulfills the old law. Okay, he's not canceling it out. All right, he's not deleting the Ten Commandments. Okay, but he's saying, look, if you want to really live the Ten Commandments perfectly, then you have to follow my example. Okay. Okay, so the highlight of the Sermon on the Mount is the Beatitudes. So the Beatitudes begin the Sermon on the Mount, okay? And in a way, they are very much like the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are the highlight of the old law on Mount Sinai, okay? The Beatitudes, likewise, are the highlights. There's 8 Beatitudes. This is how Jesus begins the Sermon on the Mount. And then there's, 3 other chapters after the Beatitudes. So the Beatitudes are kind of like the highlights of Christian morality. All right, they're the highlights of Christian morality. All right, so for comparison's sake, let's go through the Old Law versus New Law. Okay, so as I said, the Old Law was given to Moses on Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. The summary is the Ten Commandments. It established a covenant between God and the Israelites, his chosen people. And the focus of the Old Law was the exterior. By exterior, we mean external actions. And so the purpose of the Old Law was to help purify our actions. Okay, let's compare that to the New Law. So in the New Law, given by Jesus, by God himself, in the Sermon on the Mount from the Gospel of Matthew. So the summary is the 8 Beatitudes. So we have 10 Commandments and then the 8 Beatitudes. And what the New Law did was establish a new covenant between God and all people. Okay, so that's a big difference between the Old Law and the New Law. So the Old Law established a covenant between God and his chosen people, the Israelites. And then in the New Law, God is establishing a new covenant with everyone, not just the Israelites, but all people all over the world. All right, and so the focus of the New Law is more on the interior, okay? So the purpose is to purify our hearts, okay? So the Ten Commandments focus more on our external actions, okay? And the Beatitudes, the New Law, focus more on our interior, internal thoughts and desires and attitudes, okay? One way to understand what the word beatitude means, okay? A beatitude, think of it as a frame of mind or an attitude towards something, okay? Again, we'll look at the Beatitudes in more detail as we move on, but just for the sake of now, just to introduce the concept, the Beatitudes are about changing our attitudes towards God and towards others, okay? So, okay, so a few other things to note about the Beatitudes, okay? So the Beatitudes reveal the values that we need to live a moral life and the values that we need to satisfy our desire for happiness, okay? So the Beatitudes are what will really fulfill us and what will really make us happy if we were to live those, okay? All right, so that's it for 7.2, the old law versus the new law. Thanks for watching.